सभी का स्वागत है। आज बहुत ही खुशी का मौका है कि हमारे साथ इतने सारे दशक पे दशक के वस्सावास करे हुए इतने सारे सीनियर बनते हैं, और हम सब भिक्खु बोधि को तो जानते ही हैं, उनकी किताबें पढ़ी हैं, और अब आज उनसे धम्म प्रवचन सुनने का मौका मिला है। बस एक ही मिनट में बनते आ रहे हैं, तो आप सब अपने स्थान पर ही बैठे रहिए। प्लीज़ बी सीटेड। कृपया अपना स्थान ग्रहण करें। We all are very familiar with Bhante Bhikkhu Bodhi. Not much needs to be said in his introduction, but I will still say a few words just for the benefit of those who may not know. Bhante was born in New York in 1944, and he took complete full ordination in 1973 in Sri Lanka. And I would argue that most of the Pali teachers and scholars alive today have learned from his works. So we are all familiar with all the translation work that Bhante has done, Majjhima Nikaya, Digha Nikaya, Anguttara Nikaya, the list is long. His latest two books, or the most recent two books, one is Reading the Buddha's Discourses in Pali, and then based on that, the next book is Noble Truths and Noble Path. We are trying to get that into India at a more affordable price. Today is a great opportunity to listen to Bhante, as well as, because we are a small audience, to be able to have questions answered by Bhante. So our volunteers will go around and give you small cards and a pen. Volunteers? Yeah, so you will just go around and pass cards and pens. So through the talk, please feel free to pen down any questions that you have, and then I will relay them to Bhante, because this is a good opportunity to get personalized Q&A as well. With that, I will request Thai to translate into Marathi.
महाकरुणी भगवान गौतम बुद्ध यांना त्रिवार अभिवादन. तसेच इथे उपस्थित श्रीलंकेचे आदरणीय वंदनीय भिक्खू वेनरेबल मंदगामा नंदवंसा ठेरो, तसेच आजची धम्मदेशना देण्यासाठी निमंत्रित केलेले वेनरेबल भिक्खू बोधी, तसेच उपस्थित भिक्खू संघ यांना त्रिवार वंदन. आज आता निशांत सरांनी जे सांगितलं की आपण इथे प्रत्येकाचे धम्मदेशना झाल्यानंतर किंवा धम्मदेशने दरम्यान आपल्याला काही प्रश्न असतील तर ते प्रश्न लिहून काढण्यासाठी एक नोटिंग पॅड दिलं जाईल प्रत्येकाला. त्याच्यावर क्वेश्चन्स लिहून काढायचे आहेत आणि क्वेश्चन आन्सर सेशन जेव्हा सुरू होईल तेव्हा आपण विचारू शकता.
There is one request, and I'm embarrassed to make this request, but can you please check that your phone is off? It is very embarrassing, and it has happened several times in the last few days when Bhante is giving a talk and a phone goes on, and it is even more embarrassing when somebody takes that call. So please just check your neighbors, just check with your neighbors, is your phone turned off? For 1 hour if you don't get a call, it's okay, but please turn off your phones. मेरी आप सबसे विनती है कि अपना फ़ोन बंद कर दे, साइलेंट मोड में भी मत करें, 1 घंटे के लिए फ़ोन को बंद ही कर दे.
इथे उपस्थित सर्व धम्म बंधू आणि भगिनींनो, सर्वांना नमो बुद्धाय. आपण इथे सगळेजण वेनरेबल भिक्खू बोधी यांची दैनंदिन जीवनात भगवान बुद्धाचे ज्ञान यावर धम्मदेशना ऐकण्यासाठी खूप आतुर झाला आहात. हा धम्मश्रवणाचा आनंद आपण घेणार आहात आणि म्हणूनच धम्मदेशना देताना किंवा ऐकताना मोबाईलच्या आवाजाने त्यात व्यत्यय यायला नको असं आपल्याला प्रत्येकाला नक्कीच वाटतं. तर यासाठी मी सर्वांना कळकळीची विनंती करते की प्रत्येकाने आपापले मोबाईल कृपया बंद ठेवावेत, अन्यथा सायलेंट मोडवर ठेवावेत. आणि प्रत्येकाने निशानजीने सांगितल्याप्रमाणे प्रत्येकाने जरा शेजारी डावीकडे आणि उजवीकडेही बघा की त्यांनीही आपापले मोबाईल बंद करून ठेवलेत ना. तर कृपया सर्वांनी मोबाईल बंद करून ठेवूया आणि आपण धम्मश्रवणाचा आनंद घेऊया.
We will now formally begin by requesting Bhante to give us the three Ratna and the 5 precepts. I request Thai to please come.
याचना करण्यासाठी मी इंदू बोरकर यांना निमंत्रित करते, ज्या सिनियर धम्म उपासिका आहेत. आपल्या सर्वांतर्फे त्या याचना करते.
आदरणीय भंतेजीकडे आपण त्रिशरण आणि पंचशिलाची याचना करीत आहोत. प्रथम मी आदर्शांना वंदन करते, तथागतांना वंदन करते. अरहं सम्मा संबुद्धो भगवा बुद्धं भगवन्तं अभिवादेमि. स्वाखातो भगवता धम्मो धम्मं नमस्सामि. सुपटिपन्नो भगवतो सावकसङ्घो सङ्घं नमामि. याचना. ओकासवन्दामि भन्ते द्वारतयेन कतं सब्बं अपराधं खमतु मे भन्ते. ओकासखमामि भन्ते. द्वितीयम्पि ओकासवन्दामि भन्ते द्वारतयेन कतं सब्बं अपराधं खमतु मे भन्ते. ओकासखमामि भन्ते. तृतीयम्पि ओकासवन्दामि भन्ते द्वारतयेन कतं सब्बं अपराधं खमतु मे भन्ते. ओकासखमामि भन्ते. ओकास अहं भन्ते. तिसरणेन सह पंचशीलं धम्मं याचामि. अनुग्रहं कृत्वा शीलं देथ मे भन्ते. अनुकम्पं उपादाय. द्वितीयम्पि ओकास अहं भन्ते. तिसरणेन सह पंचशीलं धम्मं याचामि. अनुग्रहं कृत्वा शीलं देथ मे भन्ते. अनुकम्पं उपादाय. तृतीयम्पि ओकास अहं भन्ते. तिसरणेन सह पंचशीलं धम्मं याचामि. अनुग्रहं कृत्वा शीलं देथ मे भन्ते. अनुकम्पं उपादाय.
Yamahang vadami tang vadeta.
Bhante.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato Samma Sambuddhassa.
Buddham Saranam Gacchami.
Buddhang Saranang Gacchami.
Dhammam Saranam Gacchami.
Dhammang Saranang Gacchami.
Sangham Saranam Gacchami.
Sanghang Saranang Gacchami.
Dutiyampi Buddham Saranam Gacchami.
Dutiyampi Buddhang Saranang Gacchami.
Dutiyampi Dhammam Saranam Gacchami.
Dutiyampi Dhammang Saranang Gacchami.
Dutiyampi Sangham Saranam Gacchami.
Dutiyampi Sanghang Saranang Gacchami.
Tadiyampi Buddham Saranam Gacchami.
Tatiyampi Buddhang Saranang Gacchami.
Tadiyampi Dhammam Saranam Gacchami.
Tatiyampi Dhammang Saranang Gacchami.
Tadiyampi Sangham Saranam Gacchami.
Tatiyampi Sanghang Saranang Gacchami.
Saranagamanam Sampunang.
Ambhante.
Panati Pata Veramani Sikapadam Samadhiyami.
Panatipata Veramani Sikhapadang Samadhiyami.
Adina Dana Veramani Sikapadam Samadhiyami.
Adinnadana Veramani Sikhapadang Samadhiyami.
Kamesu Michachara Veramani Sikapadam Samadhiyami.
Kame Sumichachara Veramani Sikhapadang Samadhiyami.
Musavada Veramani Sikapadam Samadhiyami.
Musavada Veramani Sikhapadang Samadhiyami.
Sura Meriya Maja Pamada Tana Veramani Sikapadam Samadhiyami.
Surameraya Majjapamadatthana Veramani Sikhapadang Samadhiyami.
Ti Saranena Saha Panchasilang Dhammang Sadhukang Surakitang Katva Apamadena Sampadeta.
Ambhante. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you.
Okay, it's okay. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, so let me begin by thanking the Buddhist community of Mumbai for inviting me to give a little talk today. This is the last full day. I've been in India now for about 6 weeks, and this is my last full day in India. And so I'm very impressed to see such a strong and vibrant Buddhist communities throughout places in India that I visited, Mumbai and Bangalore, Arunachal Pradesh, and in South India as well, in Chennai. And so I think Buddhism has a bright future here in India. As we all know, the true value of India, the true contribution India can make to world culture is not its technological innovations and its technological development, not its ability in the field of finance and business management, but the true heritage of India is its contribution to world spirituality. And among all of the different spiritual systems and teachings of India, the most precious, the most beautiful, the most splendid is the Buddha Dharma. It's misfortunate, unfortunate that India lost its Buddhist heritage many centuries ago. Buddhism survived only in small pockets, but now, beginning in the 20th century, there's been a gradual revival of Buddhist life, Buddhist practice, Buddhist faith and devotion here in India. And I hope that Buddhism will continue to grow and to flourish in India. And for that to be possible, what we need, I think, primarily two things amongst other things. One would be good, clear, reliable translations of the fundamental Buddhist texts into the various languages of India, Hindi, Marathi, Tamil, Telugu, and the other languages, Bengali. So that's one requirement. The other requirement would be the spread of the monastic order of bhikkhus throughout India. Now there are pockets of bhikkhus here and there, but we need a much larger, well-educated, well-trained monastic community, those who bear the burden of the Buddha's teaching, who bear the heritage and can exemplify it most beautifully in their practice of the Dhamma, the practice guided by the Vinaya, the code of discipline, and involving learning, abilities and skills in practice and in teaching. And Nishant has suggested as a topic for me to speak about today the practice of Dharma in everyday life, especially in relation to a layperson. And we know that even though I just mentioned the importance of the Bhikkhu Sangha and Bhikkhuni Sangha in maintaining, preserving, and transmitting the Buddha's teachings, but the Buddhist community functions through the interplay, the mutual support of these two segments of the Buddhist community, that is the monastics and the lay community. And probably in numbers, even during the Buddha's time, probably the lay Buddhists outnumbered the monastics. I don't know the ratio, perhaps 1,000 to 1. And so the Buddha, when he traveled over the villages and towns of northeast India, gave many, many teachings that are relevant to the practice of the lay Buddhist life. My own suspicion is that the Buddha probably gave many, many more discourses to lay people dealing with lay concerns than have been preserved in the Sutta Pitaka, because the Sutta Pitaka was compiled, collected, and preserved by monks, and monks naturally would preserve the teachings that were most relevant to themselves, that is, the teachings relevant to the monastic life. But it's fortunate that we find in the Sutta Pitaka quite a significant number of discourses that the Buddha addressed to lay people. And there's a theme that occurs in quite a number of suttas that the Buddha gave to lay people, in which the Buddha emphasized 4 qualities to be developed, to be practiced, to be cultivated by a lay disciple. And so we find these especially mentioned in the Anguttara Nikaya, the numerical discourses of the Buddha, in the Book of Fours, in the Book of Eights. So what are these 4 qualities? So first I'll just mention them and then I'll elaborate on them. They are, in Pali, Saddha, Sila, Chagga, and Panya. In English, faith, moral conduct, generosity, and wisdom. And we could see that of these 4 qualities, the Buddha always begins with Saddha, with faith, because faith is the starting point for the practice of the entire Dhamma. In fact, when we become a Buddhist, when we embrace Buddhism, the way we do so is by going for refuge to the 3 jewels. And that going for refuge is an expression, a verbal expression of the inner quality of Saddha, of faith. And so we have faith directed to the 3 jewels, to the Buddha, placing trust in the Buddha as being the fully enlightened teacher, the one who has discovered the Dhamma and who makes the Dhamma known to the world. Then we have faith in the Dhamma, the teaching as being the excellent teaching. The teaching is said to be swakato, well proclaimed, and sanditiko, directly visible. A teaching that when you enter it and practice it, whatever one's ability, gradually, irreversibly, it brings greater happiness, peace, and joy to one's life. And one has faith in the Sangha, which ideally means the Aryan Sangha, the community, the spiritual community of noble ones. But in everyday life, in a practical way, it means faith in the monastic community as those who maintain, preserve, and practice the Buddha's teachings. And so there's a sutta where the Buddha speaks about how these 3 qualities, or these 3 objects of refuge, are each supreme in their own particular category. So the Buddha says, of all living beings, whatever living beings there are, whether they have 2 feet, 4 feet, many feet, no feet, of all those living beings, the foremost, the most excellent living being is the Buddha, the Tathagata, the Arahat, the fully enlightened one. And when you just look at that, it seems a little bit, some people would criticize that and say, here's the Buddha boasting about himself. If I come up here and I say, of all Buddhist monks in this world, I am the best, the foremost, the most excellent, people will say, what a braggart, what a boastful, empty head. But the Buddha is one who can make that statement truthfully, because the Buddha is free of all traces of ego, all sense of asmimana, of all sense of I am, all conceit. And so he's just speaking as the objective voice of truth, the voice of objective truth, and saying that he is the foremost of all living beings. And what makes the Buddha foremost of all living beings, even though the Buddha has countless excellent qualities, but we can sort of compress all of these qualities down to 3 essential qualities. First, the Buddha is one who is fully purified in mind, that he's uprooted, eradicated, and destroyed all of the kilesas, all of the defilements, no matter what class they are, the asavas, the latent tendencies, the fetters, all of them have been completely destroyed irreversibly so that they could never occur again. Even the very subtlest impressions of those defilements have been removed. What are called the vasana, the subtle habit energies of the defilements have been eradicated. So the Buddha's mind stream is so bright and brilliant and pure through the elimination of all defilements. So that is the first wondrous quality of the Buddha, which we can say is expressed by that designation, Arahan. The Buddha is an Arahat because he's eradicated all the defilements, and by eradicating all defilements, he's gained liberation from the cycle of repeated birth and death, samsara. The second wondrous quality of the Buddha is his wisdom. And according to the Buddhist tradition, this is identified as the Sabbanyuta Jnana, that is the omniscient knowledge. I don't know whether that necessarily means that the Buddha knows every single little fact, like how many flowers are in this bouquet that is present in front of me. I don't think the Buddha 2,500 years ago would have known how many flowers are here. If you asked the Buddha how to operate a Macintosh computer, probably he would have asked, what is a Macintosh computer? But what the Buddha has known through his wisdom is the nature of all dharmas, the nature, the fundamental nature of all phenomena, so that his wisdom, his knowledge, penetrates through all the different phenomena in all the different realms of existence. And so the Buddha becomes a lokavidu, the knower of the world, who can describe the different planes of existence, from the hell realm, the realm of the ghosts, the animal realm, the human realm, the various heavenly realms, the Brahma world, the realm of the formless realm. So all of that comes within the range of the Buddha's wisdom. And through the Buddha's wisdom, he has the practical skill in teaching, the ability to formulate the teaching in the way that addresses the needs, the interests, the tendencies of the people that he's speaking to. And so that is the practical application of the Buddha's wisdom, that skill in teaching, the ability to formulate the teaching in the way that directly impacts our lives. Okay, so the second wondrous quality of the Buddha is his wisdom. And then the third wonderful quality of the Buddha flows out from his wisdom, flows out from his purity, and that is the Buddha's great compassion. So according to the traditional accounts, the Buddha started his career towards Buddhahood many, many aeons ago when he was an ascetic by the name of Sumedha in the presence of an earlier Buddha named Dipankara. He made the vow, the aspiration to attain Buddhahood in the future. And then for countless lives, life after life, he performed inconceivable deeds of self-sacrifice, of generosity, shedding his blood, giving his organs away, even relinquishing his life, all for the purpose of building up, out of compassion, building up the capacity to attain Buddhahood. And once he attained Buddhahood, then out of compassion for living beings, the Buddha went forth from his site of enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, and for 45 years he taught the Dhamma in order to bring others to the state of enlightenment and liberation. And so it's said that when the Buddha was sitting under the Bodhi tree, he looked out scanning the world with the eyes of a Buddha, and then as he did so, then compassion swelled up in his heart and motivated him to begin his teaching career. And so the Buddha said he arises in the world for the welfare of many people, for the happiness of many people, out of compassion for the world. And so through these three qualities, his perfect purity, his penetrating wisdom, and his great compassion, the Buddha becomes the foremost of all living beings. And so when we take refuge in the Buddha, we're taking refuge in that person who has the capacity, the ability to lead us and guide us on the way to liberation from suffering. Okay, so that is why the Buddha is the foremost of all living beings. Then the second object of faith is the Dharma. And so in the sutta on the foremost types of confidence, the Buddha says that there are many different teachings in the world. And in the Brahmajala Sutta, he classifies and enumerates and classifies 62 different philosophies and religious beliefs that were current during his own time. But the Buddha says of all spiritual teachings, the foremost is this Dharma, the Dharma proclaimed by the Buddha. And again, this is not done through boastfulness, saying my teaching is better than that of the others, but because the Dhamma is the teaching that provides us with the clear lens for understanding our own human condition. The Buddha immediately homes in on the fundamental problem at the heart of human existence. And what is that fundamental problem? The problem of dukkha, or suffering. And so the Buddha analyzes the different aspects of dukkha, the different aspects of suffering. And he sees the suffering, not only the suffering that we experience in this life, but through his vast vision, he can see how human life is just one little, this present human life is just one little link in a beginningless chain of lives, the beginningless round of samsara, the round of birth and death. And then in the second noble truth, he traces suffering to its cause, its origin in craving. Third truth, he gives the remedy, the elimination of craving and the other defilements. And in the fourth noble truth, he teaches the path, the way to liberation from suffering. So because the Buddha explains this, analyzes and shows the human condition so clearly with such precision, such depth, we say that this Dhamma is the foremost of all teachings. And the path that the Buddha lays down is the foremost of all paths. We could say that the path of the Buddha is a kind of spotless and pure path. It doesn't have any defiled elements in it. We never see any condemnation of others, but the path proceeds in a very methodical, systematic way through right view, leading to right intentions. And on that basis, one develops the factors, the ethical factors, the three ethical factors, right speech, right action, right livelihood. And on the basis of that, one develops the meditative factors of right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So that's quite a unique and special path. And what makes that path very distinctive, I would say the distinguishing factor of the path is the seventh factor, the factor of right mindfulness. Yeah, some years ago, I remember reading an American scholar who said that we could find the Noble Eightfold Path in many other religious teachings. It's not something unique to the Buddha Dharma. So when he said that, I wrote a paper criticizing his position and saying, can you point out another spiritual teaching, another religion which has the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And the fact is that it's not possible to find another teaching with the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And yet the Buddha says that the 4 foundations of mindfulness are the indispensable path for attaining liberation from suffering. Okay, and then, so that is the second object of refuge. The third object of refuge of faith is the Sangha. And as I mentioned earlier, what's meant by the Sangha as an object of refuge is not the monastic order as such, but it's the community, the spiritual community of noble ones, which are the stream enterer, once returner, non-returner, and arahat, and especially the arahats, the community of the arahats, those who have taken up the practice of the Dhamma, followed it to its end, and have reached, realized, and embody the final goal. And so we look to the Sangha as our refuge. And so we have these 3 objects of faith. Faith in the Buddha, in the Dharma, and the Sangha. But now, faith in itself is not a sufficient guarantee of liberation, but faith is the starting point. In the Sutta Nipata, the Buddha says, Saddha bijang, that faith is the seed. And so when you plant the seed in the ground, just by planting the seed doesn't mean that you have the flower or the tree, but you have to take care of the seed. You have to water the seed. You have to give it fertilizer. And when you tend to the seed, then the seed will send up its sprout. The sprout will grow higher and higher. It will become a stalk. If it's a tree, the trunk of the tree will grow up, send out its branches, and then the branches will bring out its leaves. And if it's a flowering tree, the tree will bring forth flowers and fruits. And so we start with faith, but we have to nurture that faith. And one way to nurture that faith, this is what I recommend to people. When you take refuge, you don't just take refuge one time and think, I've gone for refuge, now I'm a Buddhist. But you have to make the going for refuge part of your daily practice. So every day when you do you can do a little puja in which you recite the 3 refuges, not just doing it as a mechanical observance, but you bring to mind, with each recitation, you bring to mind the qualities briefly of the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. Like you could say, I take refuge. I take refuge in the Buddha, the supreme teacher of the world. I take refuge in the Dhamma, the incomparable path to liberation. I take refuge in the Sangha, the community of noble ones who have entered the path and realized the fruit. And so you bring to mind the qualities of the 3 jewels, and while you're doing so, you're generating this quality that we call pasada. Pasada is trust or confidence. And as you bring the 3 jewels to mind, then the mind settles down, becomes peaceful and clear. And that inspires you to continue your practice of the Buddha's teachings. Okay, so we go from faith, then we come to the next quality which is mentioned among these 4 pillars of the Dhamma. This is Sila. And Sila we can translate as ethical conduct, good behavior, good conduct. And this has, you could say, two levels of Sila. In Pali, we call them Varita and Charita. Varita is Sila, good conduct by way of restraint. And this is the kind of Sila that we undertake that we develop when we undertake the 5 precepts. And so we take these 5 precepts to abstain from killing, to abstain from stealing, to abstain from sexual misconduct, to abstain from false speech, to abstain from the use of intoxicants. And so when you take these 5 precepts, you are putting a kind of brake on the mind to control your behavior. Because where does behavior come from? Behavior comes from the mind. You know, in the first verse of the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, Mano Pubangama Dhamma, Mano Setta, Mano Maya, that all Dhammas originate from the mind. So it's from the mind that there originate corrupt or defiled actions of body and speech. And so when we take the 5 precepts, we are putting some restraining force on the mind, reminding ourselves to avoid killing, to avoid stealing, to avoid the other kinds of transgression. And as we do so, again, this is something that should be repeated every day. At the beginning of the day, to recite with mindfulness and with clear understanding, recite the 5 precepts. And in this way, you are building up in the mind a strong force of moral restraint. And so whenever a tendency arises, an impulse to violate these precepts, any of these precepts, because you've been reciting this on a daily basis, that voice of restraint will arise and stop you from engaging in a transgression. And when you observe these precepts of restraint, the benefit comes not only to yourself, but it also comes to many, many other human beings and other living beings. There's a wonderful sutta, it's in the Anguttara Nikaya, the Book of the Eights, where the Buddha speaks about 8 types of gifts. And he says that there are 5 of those 8 gifts, 5 of them, he says, a person who takes the precept to abstain from the destruction of life gives safety and security to countless living beings. Because, for example, if I take the precept to avoid killing, it means that every other person, every other living being, even flies and mosquitoes, can feel safe in my presence. Of course, I don't want to invite the mosquitoes to come to suck my blood, but if the mosquito has a thinking mind, it will know that I'm not going to squat it and kill it. And so when you take that precept to abstain from killing, then you're protecting, you're giving security to all other beings. And the same can apply with stealing, sexual misconduct, false speech, the use of intoxicants. Taking these 5 precepts, you become a protector of the world. And through your conduct, you become, I say, a model or an example of wonderful conduct for the whole world. Okay, so that is the aspect of Sila, the aspect of restraint or refraining from unwholesome actions. But the other aspect of Sila is Charita, which is the cultivation of positive virtues. And for each of these 5 precepts, there is a corresponding virtue which you cultivate along with the practice of restraint. So when you take the precept to abstain from killing, implicitly you are cultivating the virtue of compassion, because you recognize that just as you yourself cherish your own life, so every other person, every other living being cherishes their life. And when you reflect in that way, it gives rise to compassion, to anukampa, that mind that shakes with the suffering of others and doesn't want to inflict any suffering on others. When you take the precept to abstain from stealing, the corresponding virtue is honesty and contentment, that you remain content with your own possessions and you remain honest and trustworthy so that other people can trust you with their possessions. When you take the precept to abstain from sexual misconduct, the positive counterpart to that is faithfulness, remaining faithful to your own partner, or if you're a monastic, then you observe the virtue of celibacy, purifying the mind of the sensual desire and craving. When you take the precept to abstain from false speech, the positive counterpart to that is truthful speech, which doesn't mean that you can speak anything that comes to your mind because it's true, but you make sure to, especially when you have to speak on something which is of momentous importance, you make sure that you are speaking the truth and that you don't tell falsehood to secure your own benefit in some dishonest way, and you don't speak falsehood in order to harm others. And when you make that commitment to speak the truth, it builds up within your character a very, very strong commitment to truth, so that other people just spontaneously and naturally will trust your word. I don't know if you've had this experience, but I've had it where I meet somebody for the first time. I don't know anything about them, but just when we have a little conversation, I start to pick up some vibrations that I don't know whether I can really believe what this person is saying, that they don't seem like an honest person. So that is one kind of feeling that you get. But when you meet another person, you get the feeling, this person is trustworthy. I can believe the word of this person. And so when you practice that strong commitment to truthful speech, you build up that force in your own mind so that it sort of flows out as a kind of vibrational field. So when other people meet you, even for the first time, they get a sense that they can trust your word, that you're believable, that you're a person in whom they can place confidence. And that's a very, very positive, very desirable quality. And then abstaining from the use of intoxicants, the positive virtue is clarity of mind, the ability to develop mindfulness and clear comprehension, sati sampajanya, which you can't develop if you're using intoxicants. Okay, so this is Sila, virtuous conduct, good conduct, which in the scheme of the threefold training, we have Sila as the basis for Samadhi. Samadhi is the basis for Panya. But here I'm speaking about a different scheme which the Buddha intended for lay disciples. Okay, the next virtue that the Buddha mentions for the lay disciple is Chagga. Chagga is generosity. Excuse me. And generosity is the inner disposition that corresponds to dana. Dana is the act of giving, but the act of giving flows from an inner disposition. And that inner disposition, or that tendency of mind, that quality of mind, is called Chagga in Pali, Tyaga in Sanskrit. And that is the disposition of mind to relinquish one's possessions when there's a chance to do so, or to share one's wealth and fortune, good fortune, with others. And so the Buddha commends Chagga, this quality of generosity, and he always praises the positive manifestation of generosity in the act of giving. Now, in Buddhist tradition, dana is very often understood in a rather narrow sense as being the act of giving that when lay people give the supports to the monastics, when lay people give the monks the robes, alms food, give them shelters, give them medicines. But I think we should understand generosity in a much broader way, that we should be willing and ready to give to others no matter what their situation is. And there's an interesting passage that occurs in some of the later commentaries, particularly from the northern tradition of Buddhism, in which I found a classification, an interesting classification of 3 fields or objects of generosity. There is the field of reverence, the field of gratitude, and the field of compassion. The field of reverence are renunciants. That is, the Buddha says, samana brahmana. That is, ascetics and the renunciant Brahmins, those who renounce the worldly life, the household life, to live a life of self-discipline, meditation, renunciation. And so they receive the offerings of householders out of respect and reverence. And the Buddha encourages his lay people to give to ascetics and Brahmins, renunciant Brahmins, no matter what their religious affiliation. He doesn't say, just give to my disciples, not to others, but one should support people living a renunciate life, no matter what their particular affiliation is, as long as they're of virtue, of good conduct. So that is the field of reverence. The second is the field of gratitude, and that is the people who constitute the field of gratitude would be one's parents, one's teachers, any benefactors. So when you have feelings of thankfulness and gratitude towards certain people, then you make gifts to them as a way of demonstrating one's gratitude. And then the third field of generosity is the field of compassion. That would be poor people, the underprivileged people, people in need. And so we should bring forth that mind of compassion, a mind of empathy and solidarity with the poor and needy, and we should find opportunities, ways to help them emerge from poverty. Especially, it's not enough just to give to a beggar sitting on the sidewalk with a begging bowl or a begging cup, but this is what I think is a very important task for any society, to find out what are the particular structures and institutions and systems that generate poverty, that maintain poverty, and take action to try to change those systems and structures so that there's a more equitable standard of living for people. In fact, in one of the suttas in which the Buddha explains the duties of an ideal king, he says that the king should ensure that there is no poverty in his realm. And if a king fails to eradicate poverty or fails to take measures to eliminate poverty, then he loses his entitlement to be the ideal monarch, the Chakkavati Raja, the wheel-turning monarch. Okay, so this is the virtue of generosity. Okay, the fourth virtue that the Buddha mentions for the lay disciple is panya, wisdom. And the Buddha says, what is this virtue of wisdom? He says it is the insight into arising and passing away that is noble, penetrative, and leads to the complete extinction of dukkha, the ending of suffering. And so it's the wisdom of arising and passing away. In other words, the insight into impermanence. And that is the insight that has to be developed through insight meditation, vipassana bhavana. And so the Buddha doesn't expect, his lay disciples to go off into the forest, to go to caves, and to devote themselves full time to meditation. But he does encourage the lay disciples, even householders with their families, to spend time to go off into seclusion, even if it's just an hour a day, or even a half an hour 2 times a day, to leave behind the cares and concerns of household life and devote time to developing the mind to gain that insight into arising and passing away. But sometimes people tell me that I'm so busy, I have a family, don't have time to go to meditation, to do meditation. But what I've found is that you can use these principles of wisdom as themes for reflection. Even if you don't have time for concentrated meditation, you use them as themes of reflection to deal with the problems that you face in everyday life. Just to give an example, a few simple examples. So we have, in fact, we're all going to lose our loved ones at some point or another. So we might lose our parents, or you might lose a brother and sister, or you lose a dear friend, or a parent might lose a child. And so if a person doesn't have wisdom, doesn't have any guidelines from the Dharma, when they lose their loved one, they become so miserable, upset. Sometimes they just fall into despair, don't know how to handle it. But if you have some understanding of the Buddha's teaching of the law of impermanence, that whatever arises must pass away, it doesn't mean that you don't feel grief and sorrow when you lose a loved one, but you're able to pick up that principle of impermanence and you reflect, yes, this is the law of life, that every being that takes birth is going to pass away at some point. And so with our loved ones, my loved ones, I don't know whether I'm going to go first and leave them behind, or whether they will go before me and leave me behind, but I understand this principle of impermanence, and so I can suffer my grief, I can experience my grief, but by applying the insight into impermanence, I don't get crushed by that grief. I'm not overwhelmed by it, but I can emerge from it strong, vibrant, and energetic. Another principle of wisdom that you can use in your everyday life is the wisdom of non-self, the wisdom of anatta. So the Buddha teaches that there's no substantial, truly existent self. And now if we don't have that wisdom of non-self, then our life tends to revolve around the idea of I, mine, myself. And that fuels our ambition. So we want to rise to high position. We want to receive praise. We want to be popular. We want to get fame. So what is lying behind all of those desires is that subtle clinging to the notion, I am myself. But if we take the Buddha's principle of anatta, non-self, and we just can reflect, we don't need deep insight, but we just do some daily reflection that all of this body and mind is not mine, not I, not myself. In that case, whether I get a high position, low position, doesn't matter. Whether I'm praised by some, criticized by others, doesn't matter. Whether I become famous or obscure, doesn't matter. Because all of those ideas, those clinging and craving, come from the sense of I. And so even though we still have some subtle clinging to an I, but we realize that sense of I is just an illusion that we can drop and experience equanimity, freedom of mind. Okay, so these are 4 virtues, 4 qualities that the Buddha often emphasizes in his discourses to lay people. Faith, that's Saddha, virtuous conduct, or Sila, generosity, Chagga, manifesting in dana, in acts of giving, and Panya, wisdom. So I hope all of you will make a sincere effort to develop those qualities, and in that way experience the joy of progress in the Buddha's teaching. Okay, so thank you all for listening. And now we have some time for questions, I think.
थैंक यू बनते। मैं छोटे में संक्षेप में हिंदी में अनुवाद कर दूंगा जिन लोगों को अंग्रेज़ी नहीं उतने अच्छे से समझ में आती। बनते, I'll just give a very short Hindi summary of your speech. बनते ने शुरुआत करी खुशी प्रकट करते हुए भारतवर्ष के अंदर बुद्धिस्ट धर्म को पालन करने वाले लोगों से मिलके वो काफ़ी समय भारत में घूमे, बेंगलोर, तमिलनाडु आदि, और काफ़ी बुद्धिस्ट समाज के लोगों से मिले और काफ़ी खुश हुए। उनका कहना था कि भारतवर्ष का पूरी विश्व को जो बुद्ध धर्म है ये सबसे बड़ा गिफ्ट है जो हम दे सकते हैं, और इसको भारतवर्ष में बढ़ाने के लिए 2 चीज़ें उन्होंने कही जो ज़रूरी हैं। एक है सारे सुत्त का भारतीय भाषाओं में अनुवाद, और दूसरा संघ का भारत में और विकास। फिर भंते ने भगवान के सुत्त के अंदर जो ग्रही लोग हैं, जो गृहस्थ लोग हैं, उनके लिए सुत्त के अंदर 4 चीज़ें बार बार आती हैं, 4 गुण बार बार आते हैं, उनके बारे में वर्णन किया। ये 4 गुण जैसे उन्होंने बताए थे, श्रद्धा, सील, छग्ग और पन्या। उन्होंने फिर कहा श्रद्धा किस चीज़ों में, तो बुद्ध में, धम्म में, संघ में श्रद्धा, और फिर उन्होंने उसके बारे में थोड़ा डिटेल में विस्तार से बताया कि किस तरह से हमारी श्रद्धा भगवान बुद्ध के अंदर आ सकती है। भगवान के अंदर जो उनकी क्वालिटीज़ हैं, जैसे कि वो अरहंत थे, लोकविदु थे, करुणा में से भरे हुए थे, इस तरह से भगवान की तरफ श्रद्धा। धर्म की तरफ श्रद्धा उन्होंने बताया, जैसे भगवान ने उनके समय ब्रह्मजाल सूत्र के अंदर बताया था कि 62 तरह के धर्म फिलॉसफीज़ हुआ करती थी, बट उन्होंने जो धर्म सिखाया, जो कि 4 आर्य सत्य और 8 अष्टांगिक मार्ग वाला धर्म, वो उसमें सबसे संपूर्ण और सबसे अच्छा धर्म हुआ। तो उसकी तरफ, धर्म की तरफ श्रद्धा, और संघ की तरफ श्रद्धा, किस तरह का संघ, जो आर्य संघ है और जो भिक्खु संघ है, दोनों ही संघों की तरफ श्रद्धा। फिर उन्होंने सील के बारे में थोड़ा और वर्णन किया। सील के 2 भाग उन्होंने बताए, वारित सील और चारित सील। तो वारित, जो हम पंचशील पालन करते हैं तो हम गलत काम नहीं करते, और फिर उन्हीं 5 को जब हम पॉजिटिव तरीके से, एक सकारात्मक तरीके से जीवन में लाते हैं तो वो चारित्रशील। फिर उन्होंने छग्ग के बारे में बात करी, जो कि जो दान देने के मन में चित्त की चेतना होती है। दान तो दिया जाता है, लेकिन जो अंदर से एक चेतना आती है कि मैं किसी और की मदद करूं, उसको छग्ग कहा, और उसके बारे में वर्णन करा। 3 तरह की छग्ग भाव के बारे में उन्होंने बताया जो आ सकते हैं: आदर, कृतज्ञता और करुणा। किसी की तरफ हम ये छग भाव इन तीनों तरीके से जागृत कर सकते हैं. अंत में उन्होंने पन्या के बारे में बताया. पन्या का मूल अर्थ चीज़ों का उत्पन्न होना और व्यय हो जाना, और फिर उन्होंने बताया कैसे जीवन के अंदर हम ग्रही लोग भी ये अनित्य बोध देख सकते हैं, चाहे वो लोगों की मृत्यु की तरफ हो देख सकते हैं या अनंत भाव का जीवन में हम थोड़ा अनुसरण करते हुए देख सकते हैं कि ये मैं नहीं, ये मेरा नहीं. तो किस तरह से हमारा थोड़ा थोड़ा निखम भाव आता है अपनी तरफ से, तो इस तरह से अनंत भाव लाते हुए भी हम पन्या जगा सकते हैं. इसके बाद अंत में भंते ने कहा कि वो आशा करते हैं कि हम सभी ग्रही लोग ये सारी चारों क्वालिटीज़ अपने जीवन में बढ़ाते रहें. धन्यवाद. नाउ वी मूव टू द Q&A part of today. So if you have questions, please, there are a few volunteers. You can pass them to the volunteers. Bhante, the first question is, how did your upbringing in New York influence your understanding of the Buddha's teachings? How did your upbringing in New York and the Western influence your understanding of Buddha's teachings?
I don't know.
I guess the person wants to know, how did you reconcile Western upbringing with the Buddha's teachings, which are not always aligned?
Yeah, okay. I can't say that my upbringing in New York sort of influenced my understanding of the Buddha's teaching. It's just that when I was in college, I became interested in Buddhism, and then one thing led to another, and I wound up coming to Sri Lanka to become a Buddhist monk.
And there's a related question. What motivated you to become a monk in this life? And what is the driving force? How has your monk journey been?
How
has the journey as a Bhante been so far?
Okay, so this, I already indicated part of the answer. Okay, when I was in college, about third year in college, I was sort of seeking some deeper philosophy of life, some deeper way to understand human life. And I was majoring in philosophy in college. And while browsing through the bookstore, the bookstore of Brooklyn College, I came across some books on Buddhism, and I picked them up and read them, and that aroused my interest in Buddhism. And over the next 2 years or so, I continued to read in Buddhism, and I even tried to practice meditation on my own, but didn't know how to go about it. Then when I went to graduate school, I met a Buddhist monk from Vietnam who came to study in the same graduate school where I was studying. This is Claremont Graduate University, and he came to live in the same residence hall where I was living. And so I went to him to receive instruction in Buddhism, and he gave me my first guidance in meditation. And after some time, I decided to become ordained as a monk, and I asked him to ordain me, and I was initially ordained as a novice monk, a samanera, in the Vietnamese Mahayana system. But then over the next couple of years, I met some Buddhist monks from Sri Lanka who were passing through the Los Angeles area. I was living in Los Angeles, and I became especially friendly with one of them named Venerable Piyadasi Mahatera. And so when I finished my university studies, I decided that I wanted to go to Sri Lanka to ordain into the Theravada Buddhist order. And so I wrote to Venerable Piyadasi, and then he connected me to an elder Sri Lankan monk by the name of Venerable Balangoda Ananda Maitreya. And so when I completed all of my studies and was free to leave the United States, then I flew to first to Vietnam to visit my first teacher, and then I came to Sri Lanka. And by some ironic coincidence, when I arrived in Sri Lanka, the first place where I stopped, where I stayed through my first week in Sri Lanka, was a monastery in Colombo called the Sri Lanka Vidyalaya. And there was a monk there who welcomed me very warmly and was my first host in Sri Lanka. His name was Venerable Medagama Nandavangsa Thera. And by some interesting coincidence, he has come to this auditorium and is sitting, I can only see shapes sitting right here. So this was 1972, October 1972. So it was about 52 and a half years ago.
Bhante, changing the kind of subject of questions to more practice, the person wants to know, is requesting you to please explain the difference between Anapanasati and Vipassana.
Between Anapanasati and Vipassana?
Yes.
Yeah, what I found a bit interesting over the last week or so, since I've been speaking to people in the Goenka camp, that they make a distinction, Anapanasati and Vipassana, but actually, let us say Anapanasati is a meditation subject, Vipassana is a mode of meditation. So Anapanasati is mindfulness of breathing, and mindfulness of breathing can be practiced either as an exercise of samatha, that is a practice of calming the mind in order to attain samadhi or concentration, or Anapanasati can be practiced as a means of developing insight. It can be used as a means of vipassana meditation. And so in mindfulness of breathing, one is focusing on the in and out breath, but depending on the way one directs the attention, it could move either towards samatha or towards vipassana. To move Anapanasati towards samatha, one just focuses in a general way upon the touch sensation in the area where you feel the breath coming in and out. You don't focus upon the specific characteristics of the breath, but just will get the general impression of the air coming in and going out. This is the nimitta, the general impression or sign of the in and out breath. But the breath can also be used as a means of developing insight. In that case, you turn the attention to the way you experience the breath coming in and going out. So you would distinguish the in-breath from the out-breath, in-breath from the out-breath. Then you would distinguish in each phase, in each, say, in-breath, beginning, middle, end. In the out-breath, beginning, middle, end. Paying attention to the changing sensations of the breath. And as one does so, then one starts to note, to observe the subtle changing sensations in the breath. So in the sutta, on Anapanasati Sutta, where you have the 16 aspects of mindfulness of breathing, the last tetrad, the last set of 4, deal with the practice of mindfulness of breathing as a way of developing insight. In this case, contemplating impermanence. I breathe in, I breathe out. Contemplating fading away, I breathe in, breathe out. Contemplating cessation, I breathe in, breathe out.
I'm combining 2 questions, and there are several questions along this line. The gist is, India has always treated Buddha as a god, but merely for worship and veneration. not following his footsteps. And Baba Sahib Ambedkar had kind of made a proclamation that all of India will one day accept Buddhism. So how can this come to true? How can more Indians start to follow Buddha's teachings, not merely venerate him?
I'm having a little trouble because you see, the speaker is projected outwards, and so your voice through the microphone gets muffled. If you face this way and then you repeat the question.
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. So the summary of the question is, a lot of Indians do treat the Buddha as a god and venerate the Buddha, but don't follow his teachings.
Yeah.
And Baba Sahib Ambedkar had kind of made a prediction that most of India or all of India will accept the Buddha's teachings.
Who made that prediction?
Baba Sahib Ambedkar.
Oh, I see, Dr. Ambedkar. Okay.
Dr. Ambedkar, yes.
Yeah.
So how will that happen? What needs to happen in India for more Indians to start following the teachings of the Buddha?
Yeah. Some questions are beyond my capacity to answer. I know that within the Hindu tradition, the Buddha sort of gets absorbed into the Hindu pantheon as an avatar or incarnation of Vishnu. And so he's worshipped, but not without an understanding of the Buddha as the Buddha. I'm not so optimistic that all of India or all the world or all of any country are going to follow the teachings of the Buddha, even in Buddhist countries like Thailand, Myanmar, Sri Lanka. Probably only a small percentage of people who call themselves Buddhists are really following the Buddha's teaching. But what I would say is two things that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, two things that are important. One is to have translations of the Buddha scriptures into the languages, the national languages, clear, reliable translations. And maybe it's difficult for people to get into entire nikayas, but a good way to introduce people would be through anthologies, like the ones I compiled in the Buddha's Words, Noble Truths, Noble Path, where you have a selection of suttas which cover the essentials of the teaching, but in a form which is more digestible than taking a whole nikaya. So that would be one requirement. And then you need, I would say, well-trained, well-disciplined, knowledgeable monastics who would be able to explain the teaching, to serve as examples of the practice of the teaching, and to expound the teaching and explain it accurately and correctly. As I said, I'm not optimistic this is going to bring all of India to Buddhism, but it will help to spread the Buddha's teaching to other communities.
Bhante, the next question is somebody who's trying to follow Buddha's teachings. The next question is from a person who is trying to follow Buddha's teachings but states, how do I deal with the monotony that may come due to the daily practice of meditation?
How do I deal with the monotony that might come through the practice of meditation?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because what I would say is that monotony is one of the obstacles that one has to face and deal with. And to accept monotony as part of the path is one of the ways of dealing with it. But also what I found useful myself in my own practice, when I was a young monk in Sri Lanka, when I started, so during my first year as a monk in Sri Lanka, I was using mindfulness of breathing as my meditation object. And over some time, I found that it was getting rather dry and my mind was getting a bit brittle. Well, you're just doing mindful breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. Some people with a natural aptitude for meditation maybe can quickly gain samadhi and then experience the joy, the bliss, the ecstasy, the serenity of samadhi. I didn't have that aptitude. And so what I did was to look through the Visuddhimagga, the path of purification, at some of the other meditation objects. And so I found what especially attracted to was the practice of metta bhavana, the development of loving kindness, and Buddhanusati, the recollection of the qualities of the Buddha. And so I found it helpful. Sometimes I would add short periods of metta and recollection of the Buddha to my daily meditation regime. So maybe I would be doing, say, 10, 15 minutes of loving kindness meditation, and then 40, 45 minutes of mindfulness of breathing, or sometimes doing short periods, maybe 10, 15 minutes of recollection of the Buddha, and then doing the mindfulness of breathing meditation. And so when you add some other practices in, then it gives some greater lightness and variety to the meditation practice. It helps to break up the monotony.
There is a related question. How important is piti?
Piti.
Yes, and how do we identify piti during meditation?
Okay, so I say that piti is quite an important marker of progress or success in the meditation. So first, the word piti, various translations, maybe joy is maybe the best rendering. So piti is the quality that arises as the mind is moving sort of beyond the grip of the hindrances or the obstacles and starting to arrive at some degree of focus, sustained focus on a meditation object. And so it comes up as a kind of, I don't know, we could just use various English words, joy, delight, but it's not only a mental state, but it also has a kind of physical counterpart, so that one feels a tranquilization of the body or an upliftment of the body, as well as the upliftment of the mind. Yeah, so it's important as a sign of progress, and there are various ways to generate that piti. Some of them are mentioned in the commentary to the Satipatthana Sutta in the section on the 7 factors of enlightenment. And a very important practice I found for generating that piti is the recollection of the Buddha. That is what's worked well for me. But somebody else might be inclined to do recollection of the Dhamma or recollection of the Sangha. But those recollections, those anusatis, are very, very helpful for generating the piti.
माफ़ कीजिएगा, मैं हिंदी अनुवाद नहीं कर रहा था, मुझे याद दिलाया गया कि हिंदी अनुवाद भी करना है. प्रश्न था कि पीति का महत्व क्या है और अपने ध्यान में हम पीति को कैसे पहचान सकते हैं. और भंते ने उत्तर दिया, पीति एक बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण स्थिति है जो हमारे ध्यान में आती है. इसका अर्थ खुशी या आनंद भी हो सकता है. ये तब उठती है जब हम हमारे क्लेश हम पे धीरे धीरे ढीले हो रहे हैं, हम पे उतने हावी नहीं हो रहे हैं और हमारी एकाग्रता हमारे ध्यान में बढ़ रही है. पीति जब जगती है तो शारीरिक रूप में भी हल्कापन सा महसूस होता है. और पीति को जागरूक करने के लिए भंते ने कहा, वो सतिपट्ठान सुत्त की जो अट्टकथा है उनमें लिखा है कि बुद्धानुसति का भंते बुद्धानुसति करते हैं, लेकिन धम्मानुसति या और इस तरह की अनुसतियाँ करने से भी हम प्रीति जागरूक कर सकते हैं. But they just made Hindi translation of the same.
Yeah, I just want to add to that the Buddha actually very much encouraged the practice of these 6 recollections as a means of generating piti. And we see this in the Anguttara Nikaya Book of Sixes, sutta number 10 and then I think sutta number 25, where he says that as you're focusing on the qualities of the Buddha, the mind temporarily is free from lust, hatred, and delusion. Then as you reflect back on the mind, free from greed, hatred, and delusion, there arises first pamoja, which is the weaker form of piti, and then from pamoja there arises piti. So the Buddha recommends the 6 recollections as the means for generating piti.
भंते ने आगे फिर बताया कि अंगुत्तर निकाय के 10वें सूत्र में 10वें और 25वें सूत्र के अंदर बुक ऑफ 6 के 10वें और 25वें सूत्र में 6 स्मृतियों के बारे में लिखा है कि उसमें लिखा है जब राग द्वेष और मोह मन से हट जाता है तो पहले प्रमोद जागता है और फिर प्रीति जागती है. What is the time? 1:20. Okay, thank you. Mate, next question is a little bit more towards the social activism.
Yeah.
What would you suggest on how could the Sangha in India get more bhikkhus? What would the lay people do to help grow Sangha?
How could the Sangha in India?
What can the lay people do to help grow the Sangha in India? So the question is, what would you say? How could the Sangha in India get more and more renunciates, more bhikkhus and bhikkhunis?
I think you would have to speak to monastics in India who will know the situation here better than I do. I am just a visitor who's just come here for about 6 weeks.
प्रश्न था कि भारतवर्ष में संघ की प्रगति के लिए हम क्या कर सकते हैं, संघ कैसे बढ़ सकता है और गृहस्थ लोग क्या कर सकते हैं. और बंते का उत्तर था कि ये तो भारतवर्ष के संघ में जो भिक्षु और भिक्षुनी हैं उनसे बात करके ज़्यादा अच्छे से इसका उत्तर मिल सकता है क्योंकि वो तो कुछ ही हफ्तों के लिए यहाँ पे आए हुए हैं. Bhante, the next question is 2 parts. The first question is, what is your meditation practice? And the second part is, we don't encounter bowing down in the suttas. We don't hear that people were bowing down to the Buddha in the suttas, but in the present monastic Sangha, there is a lot of ritual bowing to the Buddha or to the Sangha. So what is, in your opinion, the correct approach to bowing towards the Buddha or to teachers? So 2 parts. First is, what is your meditation practice?
Generally we don't discuss our own meditation practice except with our fellow monastics or fellow meditators, not in a public forum. And then about bowing to the Buddha?
Yes.
Of course it was done. We read it again and again in the suttas when, say, a monk comes to the Buddha to ask a question, say, Bhagavantang abhivadetva, that's having bowed down to the Buddha, ekamantang nisidi. So the monk comes to the Buddha, so bhikkhu bhagavantang upasankamitva bhagavantang abhivadetva ekamantang nisidi. So the monk, having approached the Buddha, bowed down, means he paid homage to him by bowing down, and then he sits down to one side. And the deities too, when they come to the Buddha, like in the Mangala Sutta.
प्रश्न था कि भंते आपकी निजी व्यक्तिगत ध्यान करने की क्या पद्धति है, और भंते ने कहा कि ये तो सही नहीं होगा सबके सामने इस बारे में बात करना, वो सिर्फ संघ के और अपने वरिष्ठ भिक्षुओं के साथ ही इसकी चर्चा करने में कंफर्टेबल होंगे. और दूसरा प्रश्न था कि क्या सुत्त में जिस तरह से अभी हम लोग बहुत बार आदर से नमन करते हैं, क्या सुत्त में भी इसका विवरण आता है? तो उनका उत्तर था कि सुत्त में बार बार ऐसा लिखा है कि लोगों ने भावपूर्ण तरीके से भगवान को नमन करा. The last two questions. Again about the society in India. How do you look at Indian society having a caste system?
How do
And
I look at Indians?
with its caste system,
Yep.
and will kindly throw some light on Dr. Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism. It's not really worded well. Throw some light on Dr. Ambedkar's conversion of people to Buddhism. So it's related to the caste system and how Dr. Ambedkar worked around it by converting people to Buddhism.
I mean, my knowledge of this is very, very superficial. Of course, it's not an issue on which I particularly focus. So I've really just picked it up when I visited Nagpur in 2019. And so I learned about how Dr. Ambedkar had motivated and inspired a mass conversion of people from the Dalit community to reject Hinduism because of their particular status within the caste system or outside the caste system, and he led them to embrace Buddhism.
माफ कीजिएगा मैं
And
ध्यान नहीं दे रहा था
yeah,
मैं
so
अगला
I
प्रश्न
think,
पढ़ रहा था.
you know, just so I think it was a valuable step that he took to bring large numbers, hundreds and thousands of people to Buddhism. But what's important is not simply for people to formally declare themselves to be Buddhist by name, but it's important for them to gain some understanding about the teachings of the Buddha and to learn how to practice the Buddha Dharma. And it was unfortunate that Dr. Ambedkar passed away just a few months after his conversion, and pretty much he left the large numbers of people that he had led to Buddhism without an inspiring leader.
Bhante, the last question, and it's surprising, it has come up. Several people have written the exact same question, which is how to concentrate better in my studies. How to improve my concentration as a student. How to concentrate better in my studies.
As a student?
Yes.
Okay. So this is not concentration as samadhi, but...
No, this is not samadhi. This is application of concentration.
Wow, I wish I had a good answer to that. I think if one does some mindfulness practice every day, even if you do like 20 minutes, if you can afford just 20 minutes of doing mindfulness of breathing or any other meditation subject that you find congenial, it will help you learn how to sweep away the distractions that come into the mind and focus the mind on a single object. So when you're doing the meditation practice, what your objective is to keep the mind focused on a single object, even though the mind naturally will wander and roam, but you don't follow up the distracting thoughts, but let them go, and you bring the mind back repeatedly to your object of meditation. So once you get some skill in this by doing a daily meditation practice, then when you're doing your school studies, you find naturally there's a tendency for the mind to wander, to roam, and what's very, very harmful these days for students, I think, is the cell phone. So you have the cell phone by the side when you're studying, and then every few minutes you have to look to see whether you got any email messages from your friends, whether there's any news coming through the social media platforms. So put the cell phone away, turn it off when you're doing your study, and remind yourself that the messages, the email messages, are not going to be deleted by themselves. The contacts that are coming through the cell phone will not disappear. You can attend to them later, but when you're doing your study, you focus on your study and take little breaks when you're doing the study. Don't try to push yourself too hard, because then the mind gets tired and bored and restless. But you can, maybe if you're studying for a half an hour, then get up, look out the window, especially beneficial to look into the distance, to let the eye relax, and just you could do some bending and stretching exercises for 1 minute, then go back to your books, and you'll find that you could concentrate again.
प्रश्न था कि मैं अपनी पढ़ाई में अपना ध्यान ज़्यादा कैसे बढ़ा सकता हूँ. कई लोगों ने ये प्रश्न पूछा और भंते का जवाब था कि जब आनापान या ध्यान का हम समाधि की प्रैक्टिस करते हैं, उसी से हमें जब पढ़ाई कर रहे हों तो जब ध्यान भटक जाता है तो उसी प्रैक्टिस को हमें पढ़ाई के वक्त वापस लाना है, और पढ़ते वक्त अपना सेल फोन साथ में ना रखें और बीच बीच में थोड़े ब्रेक लें और आँखों को भी थोड़ा आराम दें, थोड़ा स्ट्रेचिंग बेंडिंग करके उसके बाद फिर पढ़ाई में ध्यान दें. Bhante, one last question.
Okay.
Sorry, this was a request. It's a little it's about death. So Bhante, please tell us what, according to Buddhism, happens after death, and how do we know if a person has reached any of the 31 planes of existence? What is the process of Chuti Patisandhi?
I didn't catch the last part.
What is the process of Chuti Patisandhi? The last mind state, Chuti
Yeah.
Patisandhi.
Yeah.
What is that process? Like, how does the mind transfer from this life to the next life?
Okay, I don't have first-hand experience yet in this life. Again, the first part of the question. The first part of the question?
The first part of the question is. The first part of the question is, how do we know that after death, the mind has gone to some other plane of existence? So, what exactly happens at death, and how do we know which plane of existence has the mind gone to?
Okay, here I just have to rely on what is said in the text. Okay, so when death is about to take place, there's a kind of reviewing of past karmas, and then something will take on the role of generating the rebirth process, of governing the rebirth process. This can be some powerful karma that one has created in the course of one's life. It can be a habitual karma. Sometimes it could be even just a random karma that one has created that comes to the surface. And that karma will govern the rebirth process. And there's a correlation between the karma governing the rebirth process and the plane of rebirth, the plane where rebirth takes place. So the general rule is that unwholesome karma, if unwholesome karma governs the rebirth process, then it will lead to a rebirth in a lower plane of existence, in the dugati, or plane of misery. If a wholesome karma governs the rebirth process, then it will bring rebirth in one of the good destinations, back into the human plane or one of the heavenly realms. If a person regularly attains the jhanas and still maintains the jhana up to the time of death, then the person will be reborn in the Brahma world, the realms that correspond to the jhanas. If they've mastered the formless, the arupa meditations, then they can take rebirth in the formless realms of existence. So that is a general rule. How do we know in advance where we're going to take rebirth? Generally, we don't know in advance, which is why it's important for us to avoid unwholesome activities and to try to establish, to develop a strong, powerful, wholesome mind, which is best done through a meditation practice. And once one of our friends or relatives passes away, can we know where they take rebirth? If one has developed a supernormal power, this abhinya of being able to see into the working of the rebirth process, then one can know that. But that's a very, very rare, very special attainment. In most cases, we don't have certain knowledge of where our deceased friend or relative has been reborn.
प्रश्न था कि मृत्यु के बाद हमें कैसे पता लगे कि जो चित्त है वो किस योनि में गया, और भंते ने कहा कि मृत्यु के आसपास हमारे जो पिछले जो इस जन्म के कर्म होते हैं उसमें से जो बहुत शक्तिशाली कर्म होते हैं वो उठते हैं. अगर कोई बहुत ही अकुशल कर्म उठा है तो अधोगति में दुर्गति में पुनर्जन्म में जन्म होगा, और अगर हमारा कोई कुशल कर्म उठा है तो हमारी सद्गति होगी. अगर हमने ध्यान का अभ्यास करते करते रूप ब्रह्म लोक का अभ्यास करा हुआ है, ध्यान का अभ्यास करा है, तो वहाँ जन्म होगा. अगर अरूप ध्यान का भी अभ्यास करा हुआ है तो अरूप ब्रह्मलोक में जन्म होगा. और ये पता लगा पाना बहुत मुश्किल है. बहुत ही कम ऐसे लोग होते हैं जिनके अंदर ये शक्ति होती है कि वो जान सकें किसी और की मृत्यु के बाद उनका कहाँ जन्म हुआ है. Bhante, as we bring this talk to an end, we would request you to please give us your blessings.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to recite the verses of blessing, so you can join your hands in the Anjali and settle your mind in faith on the qualities of the three jewels. And so I'll recite these verses in Pali, which are expressing the wish that the protective power of that all of the devas, the deities, will protect you, and that through the protective power of the three jewels that you will be safe, well, and healthy. Sabityo vivajantu, sabbarogo vinasatu, mate bhavatu antarayo, sukhi digayuko bhava, bhavatu sabba mangalam, rakantu sabba devata, sabba buddhanubhavena, sada soti bhavantu te, bhavatu sabba mangalam, rakantu sabba devata, sabba dhammanubhavena, sada soti bhavantu te, bhavatu sabba mangalam, rakantu sabba devata, sabba sanganubhavena, sada soti bhavantu te. Abhivadana silisa nijang vuda pachayino, chataro dhamma vadanti, ayuvanu sukhang balang, ayu arogya sampatti, saga sampatti mevacha, ato nibbana sampatti, iminate samijatu. Then we go sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Okay, so thank you everybody for your attention, and thank you to Nishant for translating parts of the talk.
Thank you, Bhante. Just closing announcements. First, thank you everyone for having your cell phones off. It was a very peaceful, uninterrupted talk. Second, we've received far too many questions we didn't have the time to answer, but many of you have been kind enough to put your WhatsApp number or your email, so we'll try and get the answers through electronic medium back to you. And as you leave behind the door, there are snack packets available, so please take as many as you want. Our turnout was not as big. The good side of that is it was very peaceful and we were able to have a much more meaningful discussion. The downside is we have extra food outside, so please take those packets as you leave for your friends and family. Thank you. And just wait for the Sangha to leave before you leave.
Hare